I'm here to talk to you about a project we did in 2016 and it gave us something of a unique challenge, and we had to figure out how to get around this particular challenge. And that was, I always have fun with. We were approached to tender for some work with TransLink. We had a good relationship with TransLink. We'd done work with them on the current and previous iterations of the Journey Planner, and as well as a number of other projects around the traps with them. They were part of the consortium that is responsible for transport demand management for the upcoming Commonwealth Games. So they were working with Goldoc, the organising committee. They were working with the City of Gold Coast and trying to basically ensure that people have a good experience when they get around getting around the games and getting to and from, and also catering for those people who actually live on the Gold Coast and how do they manage that experience. Out of that process came one of the things that they decided they needed was a dedicated games journey planner. So rather than relying on the business as usual journey planner that most of us have probably used at some point or another, they wanted to develop something that would be bespoke essentially for the games experience. But they didn't want to throw everything out that they'd done for the journey, for TransLink, the current TransLink Journey Planner. They were actually in the process at the time of redesigning it's the current Journey Planner that you see now. I'm talking about the web application, not the mobile app, although they share the same pedigree. And they wanted to understand, what users needed, what do they need from this? What information do we need to provide them? What are they trying to achieve? Is it more than just getting to a games event? What else do they need to know? Well, we had a bit of a problem because the users that we needed to speak to were users of, or travellers to and around major multi-day, multi-sporting events, attendees and affected locals. And as Clarissa mentioned before, we want people who have really had that experience in the last 12 months. And they're kind of not thick on the ground at the moment in southeast Queensland. There were a few smaller events, single sport events that we could draw some data and information on, but getting those people who had sort of that unique experience didn't really have it. We didn't have people that could recall behaviour. Who remembers Matilda? I do. 1982 was the last games in Brisbane. Sydney was 2000. That was 16 years ago at the time. Melbourne was Commonwealth Games for 2006, and sort of the most recent sort of event that was in the English-speaking world that we could probably fix on was London 2012. So we didn't have access to the people that we really needed to speak to. So we developed an approach. And I'll talk about each of these key points. But that approach was going to allow us to use the resources that were available and hopefully bring business stakeholders on that journey as well. And one of the key things was to design collaboratively and test with real users. So what did we do? Well, the very first thing we did was there was a lot of existing knowledge out there. TransLink is one of those organisations that's always collecting information. They're always collecting data. They're a very data-driven organisation. They had a raft of reports that they were able to provide us, particularly around travel behaviour on the Gold Coast, just general travel behaviour. Guess what? People on the Gold Coast drive everywhere. Public transport has not had a huge uptake on the Gold Coast. I don't need to dig into the reasons on that, why in particular, but that was a huge issue for them. We did have access for some of those smaller events. So we had access to survey data for people who had attended the Rugby Sevens tournament in 2015 and Major Netball International. And that told us interesting things like people will use the... they will drive as far as they can possibly drive, and they will park nearby if they can. And they'll park as close to the venue as they possibly can. We got a lot of information on travel numbers and frequency. We also got, and this is my favourite thing because it was just fun to go through, a dump of data from all those people who've complained to TransLink. It was great. And I was able to sort of sift through the stuff that was mostly around events. And, you know, you pull out stuff like, okay, signage needs to be really important. Heck, I have my own story. I remember walking back from the Gabba. I'm a Lions fan, the Lions. Walking back from the Gabba, and there's this couple, they're sitting at a bus stop waiting for a bus. And I know there are no buses coming through that bus stop. And there's no signage. You know, unless you knew, they were just going to sit there for an hour. So I told them, I'm walking up to this bus stop up here, you probably should walk with me. And that's the sort of thing that we find out from looking, you know, trawling through that information. Lots of little complaints about there was no signs. That's just one example. We were partnering with Squiz. They were handling the business requirements side of things, or lending us some of their BAs and really helping us with some of the technical stuff, because of this whole technical infrastructure side of this. And we co-facilitated, really, I sat in and listened avidly, a business requirements workshop. They sat through all day, and they had people from TMR who were experts in transport demand management. They had people from TransLink. They had people from Goldoc, people from the City Council, and we learned a hell of a lot. We worked out, okay, there are going to be 3 tiers of parking, and it's going to work in this way, and you can book these tickets in advance, and these tickets you just roll up. And so those things were really important to understand. So we had all this secondary information, the secondary data, and all this added context. And a bunch of travel expectations emerged from this as well. We were able to glean sort of what from, you know, drawing through the threads of all this secondary data, some of the things that we felt users were going to be important to users. And they all had implications to the design to various levels. For example, the transparency around free travel, which is one of the items I have up there, was, you know, very important to users, because users in previous events just didn't understand how the free travel process works. What does your ticket get you? How does that work? And there were going to be business implications for that, because AirTrain was excluded. So we were able to use these to inform the design process. When we went through the business, we worked with the business in the co-design sessions. All of these travel expectations, and there were a bunch more, were used as part of that sort of guidance process in terms of distilling some of that research. We also used someone who'd done it before. Bit of Googling, a bit of LinkedIning. Found us Kavita Kapoor, who had been new media product manager in London in 2012. And one of the things that she'd been involved in had been she had guided through the process of producing the Spectator Journey Planner for London 2012. And the key thing we wanted Kavita to talk about, we wanted to get from her, but we also get her to interview some of her previous colleagues, were how are major events different? How are these major multi-sport, multi-day events different from something like the Rugby World Cup, or from a netball tournament, or any of these things that might have a more constrained kind of scope? So what did Kavita tell us? And I'm doing her a disservice by distilling it all to a single slide. Look, there were a number of key lessons, but again, we took this into the design process. And they also help inform some of those business processes as well. Things like getting everyone planning the journeys early. You've probably started to hear announcements on trains. I saw an ad in the cinema yesterday. Who else has been on the trains and heard things are going to be disrupted? Yeah. Has anyone seen any ads around the tracks on TV? How long ago did you guys start seeing them? A week ago. Yeah, okay. Yeah, London were doing it almost from the day it was announced. So, Commonwealth Games, but it's a different experience. One of the other things is that the Journey Planner was going to be a short-lived product, but because you need to get it right, but you also need to be really, well, not careful, but one of the common things that came out of the feedback that they got on London was, are you getting rid of the Spectator Journey Planner now the games are over? Because it's much better than the travel planner that we've got at the moment. So TransLink were cognizant of that. They wanted to see what things can be shared, what things can be brought over. Okay. We also went through a process of benchmarking other designs. We looked at the current business as usual TransLink Journey Planner, but we also compared it against. We had TransLink gave us 10 categories to look at, things like customer experience. Multimodal integration, that is, does it allow for different modes of transport? 10 different items. And we looked at an app called Right Move Perth, which was limited in scope, but it was a dedicated mobile app. We looked at the Rugby World Cup 2015, which was an excellent journey planner and probably informed a lot of our decisions about design, and the London 2012 journey planner. And by getting our heads around these criteria, we were able to once again get a sense of what were people doing well, what were people not doing well. And the beautiful thing about London 2012, even though it was starting to get to a point, it was a little bit dated, because we had access to Gavita, we got a hell of a lot of that context. We also created personas and scenarios. Now, you're going to say, and I know that Sophie said, don't make them up, and you really, really shouldn't. We only had secondary data to work with. These were assumptive scenarios. Okay, we had to make some sacrifices, but we used them in all those ways that she talked about. We took them through the design process. The amount of times that my designer sat me back and said, no, we can't do that, it's going to affect Danny. Probably happened far too often. I had my head very much in the business space, but he was great in sort of keeping the users in space. One of the things in terms of, again, what Sophie mentioned is pairing the persona with something, other artifacts, was that we designed, because the beautiful thing about this is our users really had a few variations on one scenario, getting around in the games. We've got Matt's a Goldie, he lives on the Goldie. Matt wants to be able to get to work. How the hell is he going to get to work when there's so many cars on the road, extra cars on the road? There are huge parking restrictions, possibly where he works. So one of the aims that TransLink had was to try and convert some of these people who drive everywhere on the Gold Coast into public transport users. And they're hoping that a good experience using public transport would achieve that. Funnily enough, I can't recall. Brain's gone. I've been on long service leave. Come on, give me a break. Okay. Collaboration. Dan spoke a lot about this. I don't want to go into the details of it, but what we did is we took all of those things that these guys have spoken about. We took all the research data that we had. We took the personas in. We took our business requirements in. I'll talk about those in a moment. And we sat down and we only had a 2-hour session, but we concentrated on 2 key pages. That first landing page, what do you hit when you first hit the journey planner, and what do the results look like? Because they were probably the 2 most important pages on the site. And that then turned into that iterative process that we like to do. We took those things away, we took all the other knowledge we had away. We start on the whiteboard. You can rub things out. Whiteboards are great. You can rub things out. You can't move things around easily, but you get the point. The whiteboards are great. Then we move to paper, and paper's great too because you can start to spell out some of the interactions and the different states. And then we moved into more interactive prototypes. And this was the level of delivery that we'd been asked to deliver. And what we were able to do with these interactive prototypes was set ourselves up for testing by allowing some of those scenarios and some of those journeys to be done. So you were able to do a search for a particular session of the swimming. And we had to think about all those things. Do we start? We started fairly simple. I'm travelling to an event, I'm travelling from an event, or am I going to a celebration zone? These are, designated celebration zones on the Gold Coast where you can go and party it up. Or, because some people who are there for the games don't know about the TransLink Journey Planner and its app. So they're going to want to use it like a business as usual one. So we had to have that in another location process. So we were able to build a fairly reasonably complex, I should say, interactive prototype in Action, and then we went and tested it. But we'll talk about, there were other artifacts as well. We worked with Squiz did wonderful work in pulling together, their BAs pulled together all those business requirements. We had a dry as dust technical specification because there was no guarantee we were doing the next phase of the journey. So we had to say, this is what happens when you click in here. This is what happened, that sort of dry as dust documentation. We very rarely have to go to this level. Again, one of the reasons is we work closely with our clients, but sometimes we do. We can do this. I don't like doing this, but we can do this. So testing your assumptions, because yes, we did get real users in the room. We'll never do a project without getting real users there somewhere. And you'll all go, oh, that looks like the current Journey Planner. Yeah, it kind of did, because the TransLink Journey Planner, we actually knew from our previous experience and the prototype that is now the current one, worked reasonably well. So we worked with that. But it was all the other stuff. It was that stuff that we saw before in terms of that to and from and getting to events and all that sort of stuff that really was the key in and probably in many respects the focus of a lot of our testing. And the testing wasn't perfect. There were issues. We did 2 rounds of testing. So tested, iterated, tested again. Task 1 doesn't look so great, does it? So I think just some final key messages before I finish up. There's always information about your users out there. Sometimes you can't get a hold of them for whatever reason. But there's always information about your users. Whether it's secondary data like we used for this project, whether it's that wonderful resource of your call centre team, who are just fantastic to talk to and know far more about your users than anyone else in the organisation. There's always information about your users there. Ideally, you do speak to them and you interview them because I love interviews too. But mixing visual and technical documents and artifacts work well. I probably didn't spend a lot of time on the too boring documents. They're necessary for a certain part of the business and a certain type of user. You need to produce that business requirements document sometimes. Sometimes you need to produce that technical specification because someone needs to know how to put this thing together. And you don't, especially if you're working in a waterfall environment, and some organisations still are, you need to take that into account. But visual artefacts, as we've seen from Sophie and Clarissa and Donna's talks, are amazing. And they really can succinctly communicate user journeys, user experiences really well. Do try to involve your users. Don't ignore them. You know, test your assumptions if need be. Okay, if it gets to the point where you haven't been able to get them into the interviews, get them in for testing. Test your assumptions. You're not always right. Test them early. Test often. And as Dan said, engage those stakeholders. Bring them on the journey. Because, you know, if you don't, if, for example, the head of digital of Goldoc had a turnaround at some point and we hadn't engaged him and we would have made some decisions and recommendations if we hadn't talked to him or had him in that process, and having him in that process was fantastic, he could turn around and said, nah, not going to happen. One of the earliest things we got from learning from him was that Goldoc all the organising committees are very funny about their IP. And this one particularly was. We weren't allowed to use Biri, the koala thing. You know, nothing like that. You couldn't use any of their products or features in the design. They may do that in the visual design. That's something that they're bringing to the table, or through other providers. We weren't involved in the visual design process. We were just involved in those initial designs. Thank you.